They didn't come with armies. They came with maps, suits, and pens. In 1884, in a cold room in Berlin, 14 European powers gathered, none of them African. Over tea and handshakes, they divided a continent that wasn't theirs to touch. Lands that held the bones of ancestors, rivers that fed kingdoms, gold that built empires. And not a single African voice was in the room. No war was declared, no consent was asked, no treaties were signed by us. But homes were taken, borders were drawn, lives were changed forever. Before the world called it civilization, it was theft. Before they said they brought order, they brought chaos. This is not just the past. This is the story of how Africa was stolen with ink and silence. This is the untold truth of the Berlin Conference. So, sit back, because this is Africa Unveiled. Before we begin, I encourage you to watch the entire video. It will help you understand why, even over a century later, the Berlin Conference is still the root cause of many challenges in Africa, especially conflicts and the lack of unity compared to other continents. If you're enjoying the content, please like and subscribe. It means a lot to me and helps the video reach more people through YouTube's algorithm. Now, let's dive in. The Berlin Conference didn't happen out of nowhere. To understand why Europe suddenly turned its gaze to Africa, we need to understand the hunger that was growing in Europe's belly. The hunger for power, profit, and prestige. By the late 1800s, Europe was changing fast. The Industrial Revolution had transformed its cities. Steam engines roared, factories poured smoke into the sky, and machines now did the work of thousands. But those machines were greedy. They needed fuel, not just coal, but rubber, palm oil, cotton, copper, gold, and ivory. And more than anything, they needed cheap labor. Africa had it all. European factories were booming, but their raw material supply was drying up. Rubber to make tires and machines, ivory for piano keys and fine decor, palm oil to lubricate engines and make soap. They looked at Africa, not as a partner, but as a resource pit. And in European minds, those resources were just waiting to be collected. The forests of the Congo, the gold mines of the Ashanti lands, the fertile lands of Nigeria and Kenya. To European powers, this wasn't someone's home. It was untapped treasure. But it wasn't just about economics. It was about status. In Europe, empires meant glory. The more land you controlled, the more powerful you appeared on the world stage. Britain and France had long dominated global trade. But now, newcomers like Germany, Italy, and Belgium wanted their slice of the global pie. And where better than Africa? It became a race, not to develop, not to uplift, but to conquer, to possess. Flags were planted like trophies, not in celebration, but in competition. Of course, European leaders couldn't just say they were invading for money, so they created a lie. They told their citizens that Africans were uncivilized, that they needed saving through Christianity, industry, and European order. Newspapers printed stories of wild jungles and primitive people. They didn't mention the kingdoms, the scholars, the trade networks, or the systems of law already in place. Instead, they told Europe that Africa was a blank slate. But that was propaganda. It was easier to justify stealing if you first convinced yourself the people you were stealing from didn't matter. Businessmen, bankers, and venture capitalists saw opportunity. If you could take land in Africa, you could mine it, farm it, and build railways, and all the profit would flow back to Europe. It was marketed as exploration. In truth, it was exploitation. By the early 1880s, European explorers were carving out territories for their governments, often backed by private companies. But as more powers rushed in, tensions rose. France, Britain, Germany, they all wanted the same areas. Clashes were brewing, not with Africans, but with each other. To avoid war among themselves, they needed rules. And so, in 1884, they called a meeting. Not to protect Africans, not to understand Africa, but to divide it peacefully among thieves. Let's go to Berlin. As the 1880s progressed, Africa became the new prize in Europe's imperial contest. But this was no longer just about grabbing land from Africans. It was about Europeans clashing with Europeans, and it was getting dangerous. Each European empire wanted a bigger slice of Africa, but the land wasn't infinite. Soon, British explorers were bumping into French soldiers. German agents were negotiating treaties in places the Portuguese thought were already theirs. Tensions were rising, and no one wanted to blink. It was like a game of chess played by blindfolded kings on someone else's board. Britain, already ruling India and parts of the Caribbean, wanted to control the Nile and build a north-south corridor from Egypt to South Africa. They believed this would secure trade routes and link their colonies through rail and telegraph. France, still licking its wounds from losing the Franco-Prussian War in 1871, wanted to restore its pride. It focused on building a West-East empire across Africa, from Senegal to the Red Sea. They wanted land, but also revenge. Germany, unified only in 1871, was late to the empire game. But under Otto von Bismarck, it moved quickly. German explorers planted flags in today's Namibia, Cameroon, and Tanzania. Bismarck himself had no deep love for colonialism, but he knew that grabbing territory would make Germany a serious player on the world stage. And then there were others. Belgium, ruled by the greedy King Leopold II. Portugal, clinging to its old imperial dreams. And Italy, desperate for its place in the sun. By the early 1880s, these overlapping ambitions led to diplomatic crises. In West Africa, the French and British nearly went to war over control of the Niger River. In East Africa, Germany surprised Britain by suddenly claiming territory in Zanzibar. Portugal drew its infamous pink map, claiming a continuous line of land from Angola to Mozambique, which Britain strongly opposed. It became clear, if Europe didn't slow the scramble, the continent wouldn't just colonize Africa, it might destroy itself. So the European powers came to an agreement. Let's sit down, let's talk, let's avoid a war by organizing the theft. They called it diplomacy, but it was just organized looting, wrapped in formal suits and colonial maps. They didn't invite Africans. They didn't ask the people who lived on the land. They didn't care about kingdoms, cultures, or history. All that mattered was this: which flag goes where? And with that, Berlin was chosen as the meeting point, a city thousands of kilometers away from African soil, where African futures would be decided without a single African voice. Now, let's enter that room. Let's go to Berlin, 1884. It was a cold November in 1884 when powerful men from Europe and the United States gathered in Berlin, Germany. The host, Otto von Bismarck, the Chancellor of Germany. The agenda? To divide an entire continent, Africa, like slices of a cake. not to discuss partnership, not to hear from Africans, but to make sure the European powers didn't fight each other while robbing Africa blind. 14 countries attended: Germany, Britain, France, Belgium, Portugal, Spain, Italy, the Netherlands, Austria, Hungary, Russia, Sweden, Norway, Denmark, the Ottoman Empire, and even the United States. But who wasn't there? Not a single African. No African king, elder, chief, or diplomat was invited. The people whose land was being discussed had zero representation. It was the most important meeting about Africa's future, and Africa was absent. The conference was officially called the Berlin West Africa Conference. But make no mistake, it wasn't about Africans. It was about Europe managing its own greed. They wanted rules for how to claim African territory without stepping on each other's toes. Rules for colonizing legally. They agreed that a country could claim any African territory if they had a physical presence there, a port, a military post, or even just a flag. This became known as the principle of effective occupation. It was like saying, first come, first served. Whoever planted a flag first could claim the land, even if millions of Africans lived there. At long tables covered in maps, European diplomats took rulers and pencils and began to draw straight lines through rivers, mountains, and villages. They didn't care about tribes that would be split in half, enemies forced into the same country, cultures that would be erased. They just wanted clean, easy borders on a piece of paper. It was imperial convenience over human reality, and it's those same artificial borders that many African nations still struggle with today. In the background, King Leopold II of Belgium was already scheming. He had secretly sent an explorer, Henry Morton Stanley, to claim the vast Congo basin in Central Africa. Leopold didn't want it for Belgium. He wanted it for himself, as a personal colony. At Berlin, he got exactly that. The Congo Free State was declared his private property, under the lie that it would be a humanitarian project. In reality, it became one of the most brutal regimes in colonial history. After 3 months of negotiations, the conference ended in February 1885. The European powers left Berlin with a clear path forward. Take as much African land as possible, set up ports, flags, and outposts, exploit the people and resources, and if someone else tries to take your land, show your flag and claim effective occupation. And so the scramble for Africa officially began. Within just 20 years, over 90% of the continent was under European control. No vote, no consent, just ink, paper, and power. The Berlin Conference wasn't a beginning. It was a green light for invasion, domination, and plunder. What followed was violence, forced labor, cultural erasure, and generations of loss. And it all started in a European room where Africans weren't even considered human enough to be invited. The borders had been drawn. Now, the land grab would begin. Once the Berlin Conference ended, the real scramble began. European powers rushed into Africa like vultures, not to build, not to understand, but to claim, cut, and control. And the first thing they did was sit down with maps and rulers. But these weren't maps of cultures or communities. They were blank maps to the colonizers, because they saw Africa not as a living land, but as a chessboard. What came next was one of the most reckless and brutal acts in history. The carving up of an entire continent by people who didn't understand it. European diplomats took pencils and literally drew straight lines across Africa. They didn't care if a line cut through. an ancient kingdom, a river that nourished generations, a language group, a spiritual site, or a family of clans. All that mattered was this. This side is mine, that side is yours. Entire ethnic groups, like the Somali, Yui, Hausa, or Bakongo, were split across multiple colonies. Others, like the Igbo, Yoruba, or Shona, were lumped together with historic enemies, forced to share artificial nations. Imagine forcing three feuding families to live under one roof without ever asking them. Now multiply that by hundreds. That was the birth of modern African borders. The borders weren't just wrong, they were dangerous. They forced rival tribes into uneasy unions. They gave one ethnic group power over another because of their friendliness to colonial rulers. They destroyed trade networks and social systems that had existed for centuries. These false borders planted the seeds for civil wars, ethnic tensions, and struggles for national unity that many African nations still battle today. The colonizers had a name for it: divide and rule. Keep the people suspicious of each other, and they'll never unite to rise against you. In their rush to dominate, colonial powers renamed rivers, towns, and entire regions, forced foreign languages like English, French, Portuguese into schools and churches, criminalized traditional religions, customs, and governance systems. What was once Yorubaland, Buganda, Ashantiland, or Congo became British Nigeria, French West Africa, Belgian Congo. Even names weren't spared. This was more than conquest. It was identity theft at a national scale. The new countries weren't created to help Africans govern themselves. They were created to help Europe extract wealth efficiently. Railroads were built, not to connect people, but to move raw materials from mines to ports. Administrative capitals were placed near shipping routes, not cultural centers. Local leaders were replaced with colonial agents, many of whom didn't even speak the language of the people they ruled. This wasn't development. It was logistics for looting. Today, if you look at a map of Africa, many of the borders are perfectly straight, unlike anywhere else in the world. That's not an accident. That's colonialism, still visible on paper. And while African nations have worked hard to build unity and identity after independence, the legacy of those careless lines remains. Border conflicts, ethnic violence, national identity crises, civil wars, and coups. All traced back to that moment when strangers drew lines through lives they didn't understand. They didn't just divide the land. They divided the people. And the scars still run deep. After the ink dried in Berlin, the European powers didn't waste time. They took their maps, packed their rifles, and marched into Africa like auction winners claiming stolen goods. This was not peaceful. It was not lawful. It was theft in broad daylight, carried out under the mask of civilization. Britain emerged as one of the biggest winners. In the north, they seized Egypt and Sudan, controlling the lifeblood of the Nile. In the west, they claimed Nigeria, Ghana, then Gold Coast, and parts of Sierra Leone and Gambia. In the east, they took Kenya and Uganda, building railroads to export cash crops and minerals. In the south, they dominated South Africa, already rich in diamonds and gold. Britain's plan was strategic: control the entire vertical strip from Cairo to Cape Town, using railroads and military bases to lock down Africa's trade routes. But their rule came at a human cost: taxes, forced labor, and violent repression of any resistance. While Britain looked north to south, France went east to west. Their ambitions stretched from Senegal on the Atlantic to Djibouti on the Red Sea. They claimed Mali, Burkina Faso, Benin, Guinea, Ivory Coast, Niger, and more in West Africa. Chad, Central African Republic, Gabon, and Republic of Congo in Central Africa. The massive island of Madagascar in the Indian Ocean. France was determined to build an empire that rivaled Britain's and restore national pride after its loss to Germany in 1871. But the French used the cruel policy of assimilation, forcing Africans to abandon their languages and adopt French culture, under the illusion that they could become French through obedience. It wasn't equality, it was erasure. Germany was late to the colonial game, but after Berlin, it moved quickly and ruthlessly. It claimed Togo and Cameroon in West Africa, German East Africa, modern-day Tanzania, Rwanda, and Burundi, German Southwest Africa, now Namibia. In Namibia, the Germans carried out one of the first genocides of the 20th century against the Herero and Nama peoples, murdering tens of thousands through starvation, forced marches, and concentration camps. German rule was short. They lost their colonies after World War I, but its brutality left a scar that has never fully healed. Perhaps the most horrific case of colonial rule came from a country many Africans hadn't even heard of, Belgium. Specifically, its king, Leopold II, who claimed the Congo Free State as his private property, not a Belgian colony, not a public project, but his own land. Like a man owning a farm, he promised to bring Christianity and civilization. Instead, he created a hellscape of forced labor, mass killings, and mutilation, all to extract rubber and ivory. Between 1885 and 1908, an estimated 10 million Congolese died under Leopold's rule. The Congo wasn't a colony. It was a crime scene. Portugal had been in Africa since the 1400s, trading along the coasts of Angola and Mozambique. After Berlin, they secured Angola on the west coast, Mozambique on the east coast, small parts of Guinea-Bissau, and Cape Verde. Portugal's control was harsh and underdeveloped. Many Africans were forced into labor for infrastructure projects that mainly served Portuguese settlers and traders. Portugal held on to its African colonies longer than any other European country, not granting independence until the 1970s, after bloody wars of liberation. Italy wanted in, but had little success. They claimed Eritrea and parts of Somalia, and in a bold move, tried to colonize Ethiopia, but Ethiopia fought back. Under Emperor Menelik II, Ethiopian forces defeated Italy at the Battle of Adwa in 1896, one of the greatest anti-colonial victories in African history. Ethiopia remained independent, becoming a symbol of resistance for generations of Africans. Spain held minor colonies, Equatorial Guinea parts of Western Sahara, some coastal areas in Morocco. Spain's African empire was small and poorly administered, often overshadowed by larger powers. But like the others, they exploited, taxed, and controlled native populations with force. Between 1885 and 1905, nearly all of Africa had been claimed. The only countries to remain independent were Ethiopia, thanks to its military victory, Liberia, protected by the United States as a homeland for freed Black Americans. The rest of the continent was turned into a giant open-air plantation, feeding Europe's factories and palaces while Africans paid the price. They said it was a mission to civilize, but really, it was a race to plunder, divide, and profit. Imagine attending a funeral and realizing it's your own. That's what the Berlin Conference was to Africa, a quiet death of sovereignty without consent or ceremony. 14 countries sat in that cold Berlin hall. Britain, France, Germany, Portugal, Belgium, Italy, and others. Even the United States. They debated, negotiated, and drafted agreements about African people, land, cultures, and kingdoms, without including a single African. The silence wasn't accidental, it was intentional. European powers didn't want a discussion, they wanted a division. And African leaders, many of whom had strong armies, organized societies, and centuries of political experience, were seen as an inconvenience. Let's be clear, Africans were not ignorant or incapable of diplomacy. From the Akan federations in West Africa to the Oromo councils in the East, Africa had its own systems of government, negotiation, and alliance. The Ashanti Empire had embassies and written constitutions. The Zulu kingdom held complex military and political structures. The Ethiopian Empire had centuries of diplomatic ties with Europe and the Middle East. But none of this mattered to the colonizers. To them, African leadership was invisible, not worthy of seats at the table, and not human enough to be consulted. Across Africa, powerful rulers were ignored as Europe plotted over their lands. Menelik II of Ethiopia, who would later defeat the Italians, was never invited. Samurai Touré, who led fierce resistance in West Africa, was branded a rebel, not a sovereign. Lobengula, king of the Ndebele people in southern Africa, was deceived by British agents into signing treaties he didn't fully understand. King Jaja of Opobo in the Niger Delta was kidnapped and exiled by the British because he resisted unfair trade deals. These were not tribes with sticks. These were nations with pride, structure, and vision, and they were deliberately shut out. After Berlin, European powers often used fraudulent treaties to justify their conquests. They'd arrive with documents, written in European languages, and ask African leaders to sign them, often under duress or deception. Some leaders were told they were signing friendship pacts. Others didn't even know what they were signing. Many had no interpreter and were offered trinkets, guns, or alcohol in exchange. These fake treaties became the legal justification for full-scale colonization. It was not negotiation. It was trickery on paper. Just because Africans were excluded doesn't mean they were quiet. Across the continent, there was confusion, outrage, and resistance. In the Gold Coast, Ghana, the Ashanti launched multiple wars to defend their sovereignty. In Algeria, Abdelkader led a long resistance against French occupation. In what is now Zimbabwe, spirit mediums and warriors rose in revolt during the First Chimurenga against British settlers. In East Africa, the Maji Maji Rebellion saw tribes unite to fight German oppression with sacred water and courage, though it ended in massacre. Africans understood what was being taken from them, and they fought back, even if the world didn't hear their voices. What makes this period so tragic is not just the violence or theft, it's the erasure. African contributions to law, governance, and culture were dismissed. African leaders were mocked as savages in European newspapers. African resistance was reframed as rebellion, not self-defense. But today, that silence is being broken. New generations across the diaspora are uncovering what really happened, retelling the stories of the silenced, and rejecting the colonial narratives that made Africa seem passive or primitive. Because the truth is, Africa was never voiceless. It was simply not listened to. When people speak of colonialism, they often use words like civilization, trade, or progress. But if you want to understand what colonization really meant for millions of Africans, look no further than the Congo Free State. This was not a colony in the traditional sense. It was a personal project, an empire of horror, owned by one man, King Leopold II of Belgium. Not the Belgian government, not the people of Belgium, just the king. And what he built in the Congo was not a society. It was a plantation of pain, soaked in blood, fear, and greed. Leopold didn't have a powerful army. He didn't have a large country behind him, but he had something else: cunning. At the Berlin Conference, he fooled the world. He promised to bring Christianity, humanitarian aid, and science to Central Africa. He claimed he would protect native people from Arab slave traders. The European powers, eager to avoid conflict, gave him over 2 million square kilometers of land in Central Africa. No one asked the Congolese people, and with one signature, Leopold became the owner of a land bigger than Western Europe. What did Leopold want from the Congo? Rubber. At the time, rubber was a booming global commodity, used for bicycle tires, machines, and industrial belts. To extract it, Leopold's agents forced millions of Congolese into slave labor. Men were made to enter the thick forests to gather wild rubber. Women and children were held hostage to guarantee the men's return. Villages that failed to meet rubber quotas were burned to the ground. And the punishments? They were beyond cruel. One of the most infamous orders in the Congo Free State was simple and brutal. If a soldier used a bullet, he had to bring back a severed hand to prove he didn't waste it. This meant that even innocent people, children, women, elders, were murdered, just so their body parts could be shown as proof. In many cases, hands were cut off while the person was still alive, as punishment or to terrorize others. Photographs from the era show Congolese men, women, and children with missing limbs, their faces blank with trauma, their lives forever altered. These were not isolated incidents. They were standard practice under Leopold's regime. Historians estimate that between 1885 and 1908, as many as 10 million Congolese people died, from forced labor, from starvation, from execution, from disease brought by Europeans, from pure terror. That's nearly half the population of the region. Families were destroyed. Languages and traditions were lost. The Congo was bled dry, not just of its rubber, but of its humanity. But the truth didn't stay hidden forever. A handful of brave individuals helped expose the atrocity to the world. George Washington Williams, an African-American journalist, visited the Congo and wrote an open letter condemning the abuses, calling it a crime against humanity. It was the first time that phrase was ever used. E.D. Morel, a British shipping clerk, noticed that ships to Congo carried only guns and chains, but returned full of rubber and ivory. Roger Casement, an Irish diplomat, traveled to the Congo and wrote damning reports about the cruelty he witnessed. These men sparked one of the first international human rights campaigns in history. Their efforts eventually pressured the Belgian government to take control of the Congo from Leopold in 1908. But by then, the damage was done. Even after Leopold lost the Congo, the Belgian government continued to rule the country with a heavy hand. Congolese people were still denied political rights. Education was minimal, intended only to create obedient workers. The wealth from Congo's mines and farms continued to flow into Europe, not into African communities. The extraction never stopped. Only the branding changed. To understand the modern chaos and conflict in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, the wars, the corruption, the poverty, you must understand this history. The wounds left by Leopold's rule weren't just physical. They were systemic. Entire regions were depopulated. Social structures were shattered. Trust in leadership, law, and justice was broken. To this day, Congo is rich in cobalt, gold, and coltan, minerals that power our smartphones and electric cars. And yet, many Congolese still live in poverty and fear, caught in a cycle of exploitation that began over a century ago. This was not the price of progress. It was the cost of greed unchecked, of power without conscience. The Congo Free State was not an exception. It was a warning, a symbol of what colonization really meant for Africa, and it's a story we must never forget. The story of colonization is not just about oppression, it's also about courage. Because while European empires were redrawing borders and exploiting African land, Africans were resisting, rebelling, and refusing to be conquered. This resistance took many forms, some diplomatic, some military, some spiritual, but all were acts of dignity and defiance. Let's explore the rebellions, uprisings, and bold stands taken by African people during and after the Berlin Conference. Perhaps the greatest victory of African resistance came from the highlands of Ethiopia. Italy, hungry for empire, tried to trick Emperor Menelik II into accepting protectorate status with a deceitful treaty. But Menelik was no fool. He renounced the treaty, mobilized a massive army, and united the Ethiopian people, Christian and Muslim, noble and peasant alike. On March 1, 1896, the Italians attacked. But at Adwa, they met their match. Over 100,000 Ethiopian warriors, equipped with rifles and fierce determination, crushed the Italian forces. Thousands of Italians were captured. It was a humiliating defeat for a European power. Ethiopia became the only African country to successfully resist colonization during the Scramble for Africa. This victory inspired Black people across the world, from African Americans to West Indians, proving that African resistance was not only possible, but powerful. In what is now Tanzania, the German Empire forced African villagers to grow cotton for export, destroying their food security and traditional economies. In response, dozens of ethnic groups, many of whom had never united before, came together under spiritual leaders who promised divine protection through a sacred potion called Maji, water. They believed this magic water would turn German bullets into water. Armed with faith, spears, and courage, tens of thousands of Africans rose up in rebellion. The Germans responded with brutal force, burning villages, seizing food supplies, and killing over 200,000 people, many of them civilians. The rebellion was crushed, but the unity shown by diverse tribes was a powerful message. Africans were willing to die for their land, culture, and freedom. The Ashanti Empire in what is now Ghana fought 5 wars against the British between 1824 and 1900. Their kings and queens resisted colonization with military strength and diplomatic skill. One of the most remarkable figures was Ya Asantewaa, the queen mother of Ejizu. When the British demanded the sacred golden stool, the very symbol of Ashanti nationhood, Ya Asantewaa refused. She declared, "If the men of Ashanti will not fight, then I shall. We, the women, will." She led the War of the Golden Stool in 1900, commanding troops and inspiring generations. Though the Ashanti were eventually subdued, their legacy remains one of unshakable pride and resistance. In Guinea and parts of Mali, Samurai Touré created a powerful empire and led one of the longest resistance movements in Africa against the French. He trained a disciplined army, forged alliances, and used both diplomacy and warfare to defend his land. For over 15 years, he outmaneuvered the French using guerrilla tactics. Even after he was eventually captured and exiled, his name lived on as a symbol of resilience. He once said, "I prefer liberty in poverty to riches in slavery." Let's look beyond the better-known rebellions. There were other resistance movements across the continent, each one a story of courage in the face of conquest. In Algeria, Emir Abdelkader fought French forces for over a decade, building one of the first modern resistance states in Africa. He combined military tactics with diplomacy, faith, and unity, proving that African resistance could be both fierce and visionary. In southern Africa, the rise of the Zulu kingdom brought new strength to indigenous power. Shaka Zulu, and later Cetshwayo, led the Zulu people against British invaders. Their battles weren't just about land. They were about sovereignty, identity, and pride. In Zimbabwe, the first Chimurenga, from 1896 to 1897, marked a spiritual uprising against British colonialism. Leaders like Mbuya Nehanda and Sekuru Kaguvi were more than just symbols. They were prophets of resistance who inspired their people to rise. In Namibia, the Herero and Nama people rebelled against German genocide and land seizure. They suffered near extermination, but their story became a testament to survival. They etched their defiance into history so that the world would never forget what they endured or what they resisted. So why does all this still matter? Colonial textbooks often described African resistance as primitive, irrational, or hopeless. But in truth, these uprisings were rooted in something far deeper: a deep love of land and heritage, a rejection of foreign domination, a fight for survival, identity, and future generations. These were not meaningless or chaotic rebellions. They were organized, passionate, and often visionary. Even when resistance forces were defeated militarily, they still delayed colonization, increased the cost of imperial control, and inspired future independence movements throughout the 20th century. What may have looked like defeat was often the first chapter in a longer story, the story of a continent refusing to be broken. The spirit of these fighters lives on today, in modern Africa's pursuit of freedom, dignity, and justice. They said Africa was conquered without a fight, but they lied. Africa did fight, with words, with swords, with faith, and with fire. And even when the bullets rained, even when the odds were cruel, the flame of resistance never went out. It still burns today. The Berlin Conference ended in 1885, but its effects, they never really ended. It's been over a century since 14 European powers gathered in a cold room and carved up Africa without a single African voice. The lines they drew, the systems they forced, the wealth they took, still shape the continent today. This isn't just history. 1. The borders that still divide us. The borders drawn in Berlin were arbitrary, made for European interests, not African lives. Straight lines cut through families, kingdoms, and languages. One tribe split across 3 countries. Rival groups forced to live together in uneasy states. These borders remain today, fueling civil wars, displacement, and endless disputes. Europe's map made Africa easier to control and much harder to unite. 2. Weak states, strong exploiters. Colonial governments never built institutions to serve Africans. They built governments to take resources and enforce obedience. No strong schools, No independent courts, no paths for peaceful change. When independence came, countries inherited fragile systems, opening doors for coups, corruption, dictatorships, and foreign meddling. The scars of colonialism are not just on the land. They run deep in politics and power. 3. Stolen wealth, broken economies. Colonial powers didn't just take land. They took gold, diamonds, cocoa, rubber, and copper. They took labor, often forced and brutal. But this wealth didn't stay in Africa. Roads and railways served only to move riches out. When freedom arrived, many nations had no industries, only raw exports. Foreign banks controlled money. Debt from colonial infrastructure weighed heavy. Today, many still export raw materials and import finished goods, a cycle begun long ago, still turning. 4. Cultural erasure and inferiority. Complex. Colonization attacked minds as well as lands. Missionaries taught African traditions were primitive. Languages and religions were dismissed or erased. Names were changed. Histories forgotten. Even after independence, colonial languages remain official tongues. This caused loss of identity, divided loyalties, and low self-esteem. Many youth know Shakespeare better than Sundiata Keita or Queen Nzinga. 5. The psychological cost. Colonialism brought more than economic damage. It brought trauma, massacres, forced labor, starvation, families torn apart, shame on culture. This trauma was rarely healed, buried under silence, but it lingers today, affecting mental health, social trust, and belief in leadership. Africa was not a machine for extraction. It is a people, and it takes time to heal. 6. Neo-colonialism. Even after independence, foreign control remained. Multinational corporations owning land, military bases shaping politics, loans with strings attached, trade deals favoring others. Neo-colonialism is power exercised quietly through money, media, and influence. The Berlin Conference may have ended, but the mindset lives on. 7. Identity crisis. Who are we really? Perhaps the deepest wound is this question. What does it mean to be Nigerian? When Nigeria was created by the British? What does it mean to be Congolese? When the Congo's name came from a European king's empire? What does it mean to be Malian? When colonial borders erased your ancestors' empire? Africans live in countries invented by outsiders, speak languages imposed by colonizers, use systems designed for others' benefit. And yet, in this struggle, there is strength, a chance to redefine identity on African terms. They called it a conference. But what happened in Berlin in 1884 was a crime against a continent. And like all crimes, its effects didn't end with the act. The Berlin Conference broke Africa's map, its systems, its economies, its confidence. But from these broken pieces, a new Africa is rising, one that remembers its past, not to stay in pain, but to learn, to heal, to build something stronger. Because history is not just behind us, it lives in the present, and it shapes the future. For many Africans, the story of the Berlin Conference and the scramble for Africa is like a shadow, always there, but often hidden from view. This is the history you rarely hear in classrooms or textbooks. Instead, what often gets taught is a sanitized, simplified version, a story about explorers, civilizing missions, and the so-called Progress Europe brought to Africa. But the truth is far darker and more complicated, and understanding it is crucial for every African today. Look closely at many history books, from Africa and beyond, and you'll find that the scramble for Africa is often presented as inevitable, as if Africans had no voice, no resistance, no choice in the matter. It's described as a friendly competition between European powers. It's framed around explorers like David Livingstone or Henry Morton Stanley, portrayed as heroes, while their roles in conquest and exploitation are quietly ignored, and the suffering of millions of Africans reduced to footnotes or left out entirely. But this version of history is not accidental. It serves a purpose. Colonial powers carefully shape this narrative to justify their rule. By telling Africans and the world that colonization was a civilizing mission, they buried the truth, the violence of conquest, the theft of land and resources, the deep resistance of African people. They made colonization seem like a gift, rather than the violent takeover it truly was. Even after independence, many African education systems kept this narrative alive, sometimes because colonial powers controlled education for decades, other times because African elites, educated in European systems, adopted these versions without question, and often because there was so much pressure to move forward, to focus on nation building rather than confront the painful past. But what happens when you grow up without knowing the full truth? You may underestimate the strength and sophistication of African civilizations before colonization. You might believe Africa simply lost the continent without a fight. Pride in African heritage can become distorted, and it becomes easier for others to control the story and control how Africa is seen, both by the world and by Africans themselves. This is why reclaiming history matters, not just for pride, but for power, for clarity, for the future. Across the continent and throughout the diaspora, more and more Africans are rising to tell their own story. They're researching and sharing the rich legacies of pre-colonial empires like Mali, Songhai, Benin, and Great Zimbabwe. They're honoring stories of resistance, of warriors and kings and queens, too long ignored by mainstream textbooks. They're questioning the borders left behind by colonizers and asking what those lines truly mean. They're promoting African languages, African perspectives, African knowledge. It's a movement, a quiet revolution, a reclamation of identity, and it's only just beginning. So what can you do? You, as part of the global African community, have a role to play. Learn the real history. Share it. Teach it. Challenge stereotypes when you see them. Support African scholars, writers, and storytellers who speak truthfully. Pass this knowledge on, because history isn't just about the past. It shapes how we see the world. It shapes how we see ourselves. The Berlin Conference wasn't just a moment in time. It was a story written over our heads. But today, we can take the pen. We can write a story of truth, a story of pride, a story of hope, a story that belongs to us. For far too long, the story of Africa has been told by outsiders. Stories written in European capitals, published in foreign languages, and shaped by minds that never truly understood the soul of the continent. But the power of a story lies not just in who tells it, but in who owns it. Today, Africans around the world are rising, not as victims of history, but as proud heirs to a deep, rich legacy across the continent. From the villages of Senegal to the streets of Johannesburg, from the classrooms in Lagos to libraries in London and Harlem, a quiet wave is sweeping through generations. People are searching through dusty archives, listening again to the voices of elders, piecing together stories that were never truly lost, just buried. This is more than history. It's an act of justice, an act of healing, because African history is not defined by colonization alone. It stretches far back, across the centuries, to the great empires of Ghana, Mali, and Songhai, to the bustling cities of Timbuktu and Ife, to the royal courts of Benin and the sacred walls of Great Zimbabwe. These were places of trade, of learning, of art and innovation. Places where music and storytelling connected people, where wisdom passed down through generations, sustained entire civilizations. Reclaiming this history means honoring these achievements. It means showing the world and ourselves that Africa's story is not one of silence, it is one of brilliance. Today, African historians, writers, and artists are changing the narrative. They are writing new books, making new films, uncovering old truths. In classrooms, new curricula are emerging, centered on African voices. In music and digital media, voices once silenced now echo louder than ever. They remind us, Africa's past is not just about what was done to us. It's about what we did, how we lived, resisted, led, and dreamed. And across oceans, the African diaspora is answering the call, reconnecting with lost languages, reclaiming culture and pride, challenging stereotypes in the communities they now call home. Together, on the continent and across the world, Africans are building a shared identity, one that is whole, one that is rooted in truth, not distortion, in dignity, not dismissal. Why does this matter now? Because history is not just about the past. It shapes who we believe we are. It shapes what we think we deserve. And it shapes what we dare to become. Reclaiming our history fuels pride in our youth. It strengthens the fight for justice and equity. It disrupts the lies that kept us small, and it builds unity across the artificial lines drawn by colonial rulers. By telling our own story, we take back the pen. We take back the power. This is a call to all of us. Read beyond the textbook. Ask questions. Share the stories of our ancestors. Support the voices bringing truth to light. Pass this knowledge to the next generation. Because history is not just what happened. It's what we remember. It's what we choose to carry forward. The Berlin Conference tried to write Africa out of its own story, but that story is not finished. We are here now to write the next chapter on our terms, in our voices, with our truth, and the world is finally listening.